And we're live streaming now.
Terrific. So I'd like to call our city council workshop to order. I didn't have an invocation on the agenda, but if you join me in a moment of silence, I did this earlier today and it's just heavy on my heart, to be honest with you. Pray for the family of Hannah, who was killed this past weekend in a terrible pedestrian auto accident here in Charleston, and her family. A moment of silence, please. Thank you so much. Amen. It shows Mark Wilbert giving the intro here for our workshop. I guess I'll just intro Mark, who everybody knows, of course, and thank him for incredible efforts over the last couple of years now, working on this project. And we're joined today by Wes Wilson with the Corps of Engineers and our dear friends with Wagner and Ball and the Gulf Institute, who have helped us look at all of this. So lots of good information and some new things we're going to be talking about today, and that's a potential involvement with Clemson University and their architecture school, which I find very exciting. Potential new level of partnership with the Corps of Engineers, which again is very exciting to me, and I believe will make this whole effort even more comprehensive going forward. And then we will be bringing back to council next Tuesday for second and third reading the formation of our 3x3 advisory committee. We've shortened the name. I trimmed it down a little bit. I was listening, so maybe not as small as some suggested, but I've got it down from 17 to 14 and narrowed the focus of the advisory group a little bit. So we got some exciting new things happening here today and a couple of announcements. And so with that little introduction, Mark, take it away.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you. I first of all want to thank all of the council members on the line for taking time out of their busy schedule today to attend this. And this will be the third time that we're before you to give you this update and discuss this study and the potential project and really the impact that something like this will have on the city of Charleston. Today will be the most in-depth workshop that we've had. We have lots more information, although we don't have all the information. But where we don't have information that we're getting, we'll make sure that we point that out to you. Our goal today is simply that, to give you as much information as we've got and let you know what the work will be for the next 9 months. We'll be working on this for the next 9 months. We really want to hear what your concerns are. We really want to hear what your concerns are. And we want to try to answer as many questions as possible. And what we can't answer now, we will commit to getting back to you as soon as we have good answers. I don't want to give bad answers. I want to give good answers, answers that we can stand behind. We have a great team of presenters today. They've put a lot of work into this, and you're going to hear in just a minute how much work has gone into this whole project. And then at the end of it, we'll have plenty of time for question and answers. From the Army Corps of Engineers, the mayor's already said Mr. Wesley Wilson, Mrs. Nancy Parrish will be here from Wagner and Ball, Mr. David Wagner, Mr. Andy Sternerd, Mr. Lex Agnew, and from the Water Institute of the Gulf, Mr. Dale Morris. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention all of the city staff that have been helping on this. I can see Alan Davis on there. I see Mandy. I see Christopher. Matt Fountain's been working with this. Jason Kronsberg's from Park, Amy Wharton, as well as Keith Benjamin and our legal and real estate team. And most recently, Julia Copeland's been helping me going over some of the documents. So thank you to all of them as well. We're going to be presenting all sides of this discussion today. This is not going to be a one-sided discussion. We intentionally want it to be get alternative views out and concerns. We want to make sure they're welcome and they're encouraged. This is too big and too expensive to not get this right. So the more we can discuss it, the more we can open up and the more we can have conversation and try to get back, the better. We're going to continue working to get this right until the last minute, and that would be in November. A project of this size is not easy. We're finding consensus is going to be incredibly challenging. I'm not sure consensus is the goal, but to have the best plan that serves as many people and as many needs and is really actually affordable. Questions that we've asked others, and I'm going to submit that perhaps you may want to get an answer to by November, and this is just for me, just some suggestions. You can add to this, detract, or throw it away, but does the city of Charleston need a perimeter protection system for the peninsula? That really becomes the first question. And if so, is this the right system? If not, can we, working with the Army Corps of Engineers, make this a system that is right for Charleston? Timing and money, these are the two biggest and hardest questions. How much will it cost, and when will we need the money, and how much? Partners, are there others that should be helping to protect the peninsula? And finally, this is an opportunity that not every city in the country is getting. Given what we know now about our risks, can we afford not to build a perimeter protection system is a really important question. And then finally, how do we make this a system? And it goes back to what I said earlier about making sure this is the right one that serves multiple solutions. It's not just a one solution tool. So with that, what I'd like to do very quickly is turn it over to Ms. B.D. Wortham Galvin from the Clemson Masters of Resilient Urban Design School. And she's going to talk just very briefly about a project they got going on. And we put her up front because she's got some other things to do, but we wanted to hear from BD about the work she's doing and how her and her team are going to be working with the city. BD.
Thanks, Mark. As Mark said, I'm B.D. Wortham Galvin, and I'm the director of a fairly new program associated with Clemson. It's the graduate program in Resilient Urban Design. And what's special about it is that we are 100% located in Low Country. We're in the cigar factory. And we consider that really special because it means that we can work on issues in the Low Country because we believe the Low Country is a laboratory. It really are the conversations that are happening nationally and even globally. And it gives our students an opportunity to be at the forefront of these conversations as they receive their professional education. One of the things we like to do is collaborate with folks on current issues that we are facing. So we were excited when Mark reached out to us and wondered if this was something that we were willing to study and take on. So the students are studying this topic. They began in January and they'll do their final report and findings in July. So far, they have met with folks who are on the agenda today. There's a lot of hard work going into this, and we wanted to know what the Army Corps of Engineers had already figured out, what Wagner and Ball is thinking about, as well as members of the city staff itself. Subsequently, they have looked at 14 different case studies in the US and globally of coastal cities that are facing issues around sea level rise, flooding, any kind of perimeter protection systems they've either put into place or aspire to achieve. Then the students looked at the physical, ecological, and cultural context in current situations in the peninsula itself to better understand what is happening and to not make any assumptions. They are using that information to make their own design proposals for a perimeter protection system on the peninsula. I can tell you just based on their research and the conversations they've had with folks who've been doing parallel studies, that it's very clear to us already that perimeter protection needs to be addressed in Charleston. And we are hoping just to be one part of that conversation. And we hope that the thinking behind a perimeter protection system will set the standard for others in the US and hopefully even globally who are in coastal urban areas. And we're hoping that instead of business as usual, we can really innovate and set some standards of how we really need to move forward as a nation. And we're hoping Charleston can be the place where we can have those conversations to set that standard. So I'll keep it at that, except that we look forward to continued engagement with all sorts of people between now and July. And we will certainly communicate with Mark and his team when we have major public presentations and invite anyone to join us, because they will, like this, all be on Zoom for now. Thank you.
Thank you, BD. Any questions for BD before she leaves?
How many students are in this session, if I may ask, BD?
Yes, we have 7 students who are studying this topic, and some of the folks that are actually, we had some interested citizens attend, including some council folks, and we got some really great feedback from Councilwoman Jackson was in that meeting, and I think they can attest our numbers may be small, but their effort is fairly mighty, and even Wagner and Ball can attest to that too. We aim for quality, not quantity, in our student body.
Well, BD, we can't thank you enough. This seems like a match made in heaven, but mostly to our benefit. So thanks for stepping up to the plate, and we look forward to working with you.
Same here. The feeling is mutual.
Okay. Any other questions? I'm not seeing any. So with that, what I'd like to do is just continue on. So the first part of my presentation is really just to set the context of where Charleston is. And then I'm going to let the folks from the Army Corps talk about where they are with the study. And then the Wagner Ball team will talk about their discovery report, and then we'll close it up on the ways ahead. But I thought it was important putting my resilience hat on and thinking about all the things that are going on in the world today and how important resilience is, just to really step back for a minute and take a look. Oftentimes we focus on the here and now, but taking a look back at just what some of the threats are here in Charleston, that perhaps this project would be able to help us to deal with. So with that, I am going to hopefully get this right. And for some reason, there we go. Okay. Okay, can you see that slide okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get going on this. I've already done that. We've done that. So the first thing I wanted to do was just introduce this slide to everyone here. And this is some information that we just got from the National Weather Service just last week. So they've got their lead meteorologist over there is doing a lot of data collection for Charleston. And I thought this was important, and I wanted to share this. So we kind of look at tides in the city in 3 increments, 7, 7.5, and 8 feet. And that's all based on datum of mean low water. Okay, that's what sailors use when they move around on the waters, mean low water. As you all know, we begin to flood at 7, and 8 foot is pretty significant tide for us. Between 1922 and 1981, that's a period of 59 years, we had 156 total tides. In the last 2 years, we exceeded that, tides above 7 feet. We had 157. Now, keep in mind, in 2019 and 2020, we had no tropical events. So these are significant. These are just high tides with no tropical events. For tides 7.5 feet, you can see the numbers there, and that was a total of 77 years between 1922 and 1999. So in 2 years, we essentially tied what had happened in 77 years. And then if you look at the 8 foot tides, which are really the ones that cause the most challenges for us here in the city, it was a total of 86 years that we had 11 tides, and then we captured that in 2019 and 2022, a total of 11 tides. So things are changing, and they're changing fast. Over here on this other side, I think it's just important to note that we face flooding. We call it compound flooding from a number of different sources. I think we all would acknowledge that the city of Charleston and our team is just doing an outstanding job dealing with rainfall flooding. We were just talking about it earlier. We're seeing the effects of that. We're doing really good work with some of the sea level rise, with some of the check valves that we're putting in. Those are having a good effect. But it's really this high tide flooding and storm surge that's coming on really strong that's going to give the city of Charleston challenges of the future. We're doing really good work. These are just different threats. I want to talk a little bit about the cost of these events. And this really shocked me. And I want to say just about everything that I'm sharing with you today shocked me. In 2020, there were $22 billion plus weather or climate disasters. And that's a new record. It's also, we set a record in 2020 of 7 tropical cyclones that were $1 billion plus disasters, 7 of them. We had 30 named tropical storms, which was a record. Total was 95 billion, but the next two ones, this really captures the essence here. Hurricane Laura, which hit Southwest Louisiana in August, was a $19 billion disaster with 42 deaths. Hurricane Sally, which was a Category 2 storm in September of 2020, came ashore in Gulf Shore, Alabama, and was a $7.3 billion disaster with 5 deaths. In a CoreLogic report released in 2020 on storm surge and areas at risk, Charleston is number 12 of the top 15 metro areas for single-family homes at risk from storm surge. So this is expensive, what we're talking about. The damages are expensive. The risk is really high. I'd like to move on, if I could, just real quick, to continue talking about the higher tides. What you're looking at here, I think you all can see, this is from West Edge looking towards the Ashley River bridges. This was a non-storm surge event in 11/2018. That's 8.74 feet. If we use the average high tide in Charleston, which is 5.76 feet, again, I'm talking in sailor language here, this is a surge of 3 feet. This is 3 feet on top of the average. If we look at here, which we see this often, this is one of those 8-foot tides, which, by the way, the prediction on 8-foot tides is that by 2030, we'll see 10 to 20 a year, and by 2050, we'll see 35 to 90. Those are the projections coming from NOAA and their climate center, and so far they have been under-predicting what's been actually happening. This is an 8-foot tide, which represents a 2.34-foot surge on top of the average high tide. And then again, this is Hurricane Irma. Just to put it in context, this is only a 4.87-foot surge. Fortunately, it came in on a 4.2-foot tide. It was about a total of a 9-foot that we had. Imagine if this had come in on a high tide. And I think, Mayor, you probably remember we were in the command center thinking about when they were predicting a 13-foot tide coming in, and it really turned out not to be that much.
I remember.
So what's at risk on the peninsula of Charleston? And this is, I asked one of my colleagues here to do the research on this. I wanted to make sure someone took an outside view at it coming in. And this is from all documented sources, all footnoted here. If we look at what's at risk on the peninsula from storm surge, currently 99% of residential properties, 98% of commercial properties, 100% of roads on the peninsula would be inaccessible. 90% of our critical facilities would be vulnerable, including our 3 major hospitals. I would say 4 major hospitals, if you count the Children's Hospital as a separate one, which I do. And then 5 institutions of higher learning, all located on the peninsula. Tourism is a regional impact of $8 billion, and it would be a risk, as well as the 47,000 jobs that it's tied to in the area. Medical, 1 out of every 12 jobs in the region is tied to MUSC Medical, as well as $2 billion in economic impact. And over 75,000 veterans from across the Low Country rely on the Veterans Hospital here for their health care, or some form of their health care. They have at many outpatient clinics, but this is the home base for them. And jobs on the peninsula, there's almost 40,000 jobs would be at risk, and that could impact the regional workforce of almost 400,000 people. My point is, there's a lot of risk here on the peninsula that we have to be paying attention to. There's 4 ways of dealing with storm surge and high tide flooding, and we're going to talk about just really 1 or 2 of them today. One is you can ignore it. 2, you can build a structure to keep the water out. You can elevate homes and roads. You can do managed retreat. You can use nature-based solutions. They have limits, but they certainly add value. And then you can do a combination of the above. So hopefully that helps set the context for the conversation that we hope to have today. Before we go to the Army Corps of Engineers, I'm going to take a real risk here. And this is really risky, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to share with you a video that came to us. We did not go to them. Google Earth came to the city of Charleston and said, we're going to do a video on storm surge in Charleston. And we would like you guys to be part of the video. And we said, we'll be part of the video, but you need to make sure that you have your facts right. And everything that you show in that video is accurate. And we spent about a couple of weeks going back and forth with them to making sure that they were accurate. This video is currently online. It's not anything new. It's out there. It's for folks to see, but most people have not seen it. But I would just want to share this with you for a minute. This, if you trust the technology that Google Earth brings to us, and if you trust the science of Climate Central, and I happen to trust both, this is what a storm surge, if Hurricane Hugo were to hit Charleston today, would look like.
That's the cathedral.
It's a cathedral.
Hey, Mark,
Yes, sir.
I saw the trail at the top said 7-foot storm surge on top of a high tide. Did you assume a 7-foot high tide? Is that 14 feet of water?
Whatever they came in on Hugo, I'd have to go back and look at it, but I can send that link to you and all the other stuff.
Okay, thanks.
But we really worked with them hard, because what we didn't want is we didn't want them going out and showing something that was just, way inflated, that we wanted to make sure that was right. We had a team in the city. We were going through the vulnerability assessment at the time. We had that team look at it. We really fact-checked that before they came out with it.
And that just assumes a Category 4 storm with it, right?
Yeah, that's a big storm. Okay, with that, what I'd like to do is I'm going to now introduce Wes Wilson from the Army Corps of Engineers, who has been working with us on this project. And with him today is Nancy Parrish from the Army Corps of Engineers. And they're going to go ahead and give you an update of where the Army Corps is on this study. And I really want to emphasize, remember, this is just a study. Okay, Wes.
Mark, can you hear me? Am I live?
I can. You're good.
All right. So the PowerPoint's up.
It is.
Mayor, Mark, we do appreciate the opportunity to give council an update on where we are in regards to the Peninsula study. So I've got some good information here. A quick little agenda. I've got a couple opening slides, and then we're going to get into the details of optimization. Optimization, essentially refining our tentatively selected plan from when we released it to the public in April of 2020. All right, so I've got one slide here, Mayor. It's a shameless plug. We are celebrating our 150th birthday in Charleston. I understand the city of Charleston had their birthday celebration at 350 years, so we've been around a while as well. Thank you. And Mayor, we've been here 150 years. We want to be here for 150 more years, so this study is very important to us. We've worked on some pretty important projects, even starting in the 1800s. We constructed Fort Moultrie, Fort Johnson, Fort Sumter. Those two big rock piles in the harbor, the jetties, we constructed those and removed the sunken debris from the Civil War. And I think this one's the most interesting. We oversaw and constructed the state's first railroad. So that's just a little history on Charleston District, and we've been around for a long time.
I didn't know you did the first railroad.
Yes, sir. That was news to me too, until a couple weeks ago. So interesting stuff.
Okay.
All right. So when I go ahead and get started, I'm going to brag on my Peninsula Study Army Corps team for a second. We have the best of the best across the country with the Corps of Engineers working to deliver the best product we can for the city and the nation. We've got SME subject matter experts on all 4 time zones working on this project. We have an entire economics team determining if we have a federal investment. We've got a NEPA lead, 2 of them actually, a landscape architect to determine the visual impacts of our recommendation. We have a cultural resource expert to determine the impacts on historic properties, a real estate specialist, a policy plan formulator, and a whole slew of engineers on this thing. We've been at this study for about 2.5 years. If we add up all the hours we've done about 20,000 hours of labor on analysis on just this study to date. And that doesn't include all the time your folks have spent on this, assisting us with this study as well.
Wow.
So now I'll get into a little recap to remind everybody where we were and where we are. So just a reminder, this is a coastal storm surge study. We are in the initial feasibility phase of our project delivery process. The ultimate purpose of our study is to determine whether or not we have a federal investment in a storm surge solution for the peninsula. And if so, if we do have that federal investment, which is a positive benefit cost ratio, we're going to outline a project recommendation. Although the solution for storm surge is the main driver, we do take into account high tide and sea level rise into our analysis. And just also what hasn't changed is our study authority, our study phase, objectives, and purpose. They all remain the same. So we released our draft report or the tentatively selected plan in April of 2020, and we had approximately an 8-mile storm surge wall around the peninsula with several different types of gates. The storm surge wall consisted of a T-wall on high ground and combination wall in the marsh. And that combination wall is piles, sheet piles with a concrete cap. Elevation of our tentatively selected plan was 12 feet NAVD 88. However, that height varied based on topography around the peninsula. In addition, we've got 3 small non-structural areas with less than 150 impacted residential homes that we plan to elevate or floodproof. We also had an interior hydrology analysis where we identified 5 permanent pump stations. And finally, we recommended a wave attenuation structure or breakwater in the TSP. So that gives everybody a quick 30-second commercial, a reminder of where we were about 10 months ago. All right, so I'm going to walk you through the 3 E's of optimization: engineering optimization, environmental optimization, and economics optimization. So the first thing we'll talk about is engineering optimization. And basically, engineering optimization, one of their main goals was to reduce costs without changing the project benefits. That's one of the main goals in this, the engineers were working on for the past 10 months. So one of the things we did was we changed our planning horizon. So this is our planning study period. We moved it from 2025 to 2075. We moved it to 2032 and 2082. Essentially, we don't start our planning phase until construction is complete, so that we felt that 2025 was too aggressive. We eliminated the breakwater from consideration. So that was a $300 million breakwater we had in the tentatively selected plan. And after doing our due diligence, we determined the benefits of the breakwater feature were not greater than those of the wall alone and provided no additional benefit other than the wall. We updated the sea level rise from 1.13 to 1.65. We analyzed the Wagner Terrace for non-structural options such as floodproofing and home raising, and those benefits were significantly reduced and that residual risk remained high. We updated the storm surge wall alignment, completed an interior hydrology analysis, determined a phase design and construction approach, and essentially that is a 4-phase approach. Phase 1 would be from the Coast Guard station to behind the Joe, tying into the Citadel. Phase 2 would be the low and high battery wall. Phase 3 would be from the high battery wall up through tying in Morrison through Newmarket on the Cooper side. And phase 4 would be around Wagner Terrace. We completed our qualitative risk assessment, and we updated a combination wall design for more aesthetically visual precast concrete panels and pilings in the marsh. We know the impacts to surrounding communities is very important. However, we apologize for not having the results in time for this meeting, but we continue to do this analysis, and we will present those as soon as they are complete. And in addition to that, we are refining our construction costs based on the latest alignment. And we will be analyzing 2 additional sea level rise curves, the low and the high. So the core has a different sea level rise curve than NOAA. So I don't want to confuse everybody, but we did this little graph to talk about how the historical Hurricane Hugo surge that we had in Charleston, not McClellanville, compares to how our proposed core wall. I've read on several occasions that the core recommendation would not stop that historical surge that we received in Charleston. And those tide gauges we saw in Charleston were about 9.39 NAVD 88. And the wall would reduce the risk of damage from Hugo and many other storms we have experienced over the past 5 years. And you can see Hurricane Matthew is in there as well as another comparison. So going back to the study objectives and the purpose, why are we doing this study? Why is this important? So the approximate water levels, the blue area shown on the left visual, would be a similar or approximate surge as Hugo did in Charleston. Many of the police, healthcare, and fire stations are at risk of damages due to a surge event. And this doesn't include a map that shows access to critical facilities that would also be in jeopardy during a surge event. Access to those critical facilities, to your hospitals and to your fire and police stations is one of our study objectives. With a wall in place, the risk is reduced in all categories. We did the same analysis for historical impacts. Again, the water levels on the left, the blue area shown, would be a similar approximate surge hurricane as in Charleston. Half of the historic structures on the peninsula are at risk of damages. I think that's a pretty significant number considering the number of historic structures we have. And then with the wall, that risk is reduced significantly. All right, so we have an updated alignment from what we presented in our tentatively selected plan. One of our goals in our updated alignment was to reduce costs. By building the combination wall in the marsh, it is 2.5 times more expensive than to build it on high ground. So one of the things we looked at is where could we move the combination wall from the marsh to high ground without changing the benefits. Again, one of the goals in optimization to reduce costs and maintain your benefits to give the city a more competitive benefit cost ratio. So the majority of the alignment changes occurred on the Ashley side of the peninsula, as you can see on the map. The map on the left shows what we had in our tentatively selected plan, and the map on the right is our optimized alignment. The alignment changes were near I-26 along the Ashley side, where it went from green to yellow. The Citadel, we were able to find 2 areas at the Citadel where we could tie into high ground, so we will not have to impact the marsh in front of the Citadel. And then a long stretch between Brittle Bank Park to the Coast Guard is now on high ground. There are also 2 small areas around the Battery and Waterfront Park that we have changed. And again, I think I've mentioned this before, the alignment is conceptual in nature, and we are trying to position the city for the most cost-effective and then highest benefit recommendation and help it compete for future funding.
Hey Wes, on the new alignment on the west side of the peninsula from Brittle Bank, is that basically running along Lockwood Boulevard? I mean, it's just hard to tell from this picture.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
That is correct. All right, so with the, I think this is a cool slide. So the visual on the left is our draft tentatively selected plan that we released, shows the wall height around the peninsula. And the picture on the right is our optimized wall height. So the darker colors, the oranges and the reds, are 10, 11, 12 feet high. That's what you would see from a visual perspective. And as you can see, it was significantly reduced, especially around from the Joe all the way down to the Coast Guard. It went from 9, 10, 11 to 4, 5, 6. So from a public visual perspective, the optimized wall height, you will see a shorter wall. And in addition to that, we'll have reduction of impacts to wetlands, and it will be significantly less expensive to build. So we also, and I'm sorry, I know the picture on the left is very hard to read, but the point being on this is we identified 5 permanent pump stations around the peninsula. The size of these pump stations are similar to the one, a little bit smaller than the size that you have at Concord Street. The Corps' responsibility in all this, in regards to interior hydrology on this study, is to not increase flooding due to the wall and bring down that water to the existing flood level. How we came up with this, we utilized overland surface model to compute water surface elevations for multiple rain events, and an economic model to compute the damages. And then we added the pumps in those strategic locations to mitigate damages down to the existing flood levels. I'd point out too on this that the pump locations are conceptual and are approximate, and we will need to do another interior hydrology analysis in our design phase to account for the subsurface drainage. We only accounted for the overland flow in our interior hydrology. All right, I'm going to turn the environmental optimization over to Nancy Parrish. She's the Chief of Planning in Charleston District, and then she'll turn it back over to me to finish off the slides. So Nancy?
All right, thanks, Wes. So during this optimization phase that Wes has been talking about, by moving the wall on the Ashley River side in particular onto land, like say along Lockwood there, we were able to reduce impacts to the marsh there and the wetland impacts from the 111 acres that we reported in our draft report that went out in April. We are currently at around 51 acres of impact now at this stage, and we are still working to optimize that to reduce those impacts further. Also part of our optimization process is a revision to the programmatic agreement that we put out in draft in April to discuss how we will work with our consulting parties and our stakeholders on treating historic properties and potential impacts to historic properties. So that is undergoing revision. It's actually with our partners for review right now, and will be part of our package as we release it in the future. So still in progress, things that are ongoing right now is we are continuing to review the public and agency comments that we received from our draft report release last April and incorporating those comments into the report. And we are updating mitigation plans and mitigation costs related to the wetland impacts. And we are working with our state and federal partners on that, the other agencies that like the Fish and Wildlife Service, NIMS, DHEC, OCRM. We work in consultation with them on what constitutes appropriate mitigation. We are continuing our visual impact analysis, which is related to the aesthetics of what it looks like to have a wall on the peninsula. And as Wes pointed out, just moving it onto land on the Ashley River side reduces a wall that was maybe 10 or 11 feet tall that you looked at down to something that's only maybe 5 or 6 feet tall, which reduces that impact, we think, significantly. So we're continuing the analysis on what that impact looks like and developing a memorandum of agreement, a legal agreement with the city to agree on a process for determining exactly what those impacts are as we get into the design phase, so that we can make sure that we address them throughout design prior to construction. You want to go to the next slide? And I got to get it up over here. This is a visual of the reduction in wetland impacts. It's similar to the one that Wes showed you, but you can see the green polygons on the left illustrate the 111 acres of wetland impact. And on the right, you can see right there in front of the Citadel is a huge contiguous piece of wetland that we will no longer be impacting because of the way we've optimized tying in the wall on either side of the Citadel, and to keep ourselves from crossing that piece of marsh right there. And then of course, all along the marina, and as you go down Lockwood towards the Battery, there's marsh all along there, that moving the wall out of the marsh and onto dry land prevents us from impacting those marshes and reduces our overall wetland impacts. I'll go to the next one, please. Okay, so I know there's lots of talk of NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and what our obligations as a federal agency are under that piece of law. The NEPA requires that we start with an environmental assessment to assess or determine if our proposed project will have significant impacts on what we call the human and natural environment, that and if we have those impacts, can we reduce those impacts to less than significant through mitigation? Once we've determined that those impacts may not be able to be reduced to less than significant, NEPA requires that we then pivot to an EIS. So that's the stage we're at now. We released this report back in April. We received a huge number of comments back from the public, as well as from our state and federal agencies, and determined that there are certain impacts that we may not be able to reduce through mitigation. And so we pivot now to an environmental impact statement, an EIS, in order to be able to explore those impacts further and make the smart decisions about those impacts. In particular, we are looking at those visual aesthetic impacts that we talked about. That was something that was very, very important to the public. The wetland marsh impacts to our cultural resources and historic properties, and of course, environmental justice issues that can arise from building something like this. Pivoting now to an EIS will allow us to determine if the alternative that we're looking at disproportionately impacts low income or minority areas. So that is, among the things that are going to be studied more in depth now that we can move to an EIS. And one note on this shift that we're making, in order to make the change at this stage in our feasibility study, we had to request an extension of time and money, right? You hear us call this a 3x3 study, right? We've got 3 years and $3 million to complete the study. Well, in order to pivot to an EIS and to do this further analysis on these impacts and consider the mitigation potential, we need a little more time than 3 years, and we need a little more money than $3 million. And getting that extension is a process in itself within the Corps of Engineers. And so this team has been working very hard this winter to make our case up through our chain of command. I guess it was the end of January, we got signed off by the Chief of Engineers for Civil Works. So Major General Graham signed our request. So it's cleared our agency. It goes over to the Assistant Secretary for the Army for Civil Works. And that office ultimately makes a decision, yes or no, that we get that extended time and extra money. So as soon as we hear from them, and we are very optimistic, we're getting sort of good feedback that that we should get that waiver, we call it. There's no telling, what an office will do, but we're hopeful we will get it. As soon as we get it, our timeline begins on our environmental impact statement. So the dates you're going to see from here on out in this presentation are all kind of assuming we get that go ahead from the Assistant Secretary of the Army's office here in the next couple of weeks. As soon as we get that, we will begin the EIS process. It begins with a notice of intent, gets published in the Federal Register for 30 days. So we're hopeful to get that published in early March. Within a few weeks of that notice showing up in the Federal Register, we will hold a virtual public meeting similar to what we're doing now, where we invite the public, where we can inform the public on the status of the study, this change to an EIS and what that process looks like. We will talk about previous scoping that we have done for the study to date, and summarize some of the feedback we've received to date. We will also share this optimized version of the plan that the public has not necessarily seen or has not officially seen since the draft report went out last April. And it provides an opportunity for the public to inform us of any other additional information that we should be taking into consideration, research that like the work that DB students are doing, any kind of research or thoughts on other alternatives that we should be considering that would meet the objectives of our study regarding storm surge. We will continue to optimize and do our analyses like I've been talking about, and we will re-release a revised draft report for public and agency review in late summer this year. So we sent one out last April. We'll put it out again for public review, much like we did in April. It'll go for a 45-day public review period. And then after that, we'll get those comments in, we'll incorporate that, and we will work to finalize our feasibility phase at the end of July. So we'll take all of that information we receive and over the course of a year, finalize our study. Again, I know Wes has emphasized, and I think even Mark emphasized, this is still feasibility. So the shift to the EIS doesn't change any of that. We're not doing more engineering or considering new alternatives. We are doing additional environmental analyses, and particularly pertaining to potential for mitigation as needed. So I think one of the other takeaways I want to make sure to say is there are then 2 more opportunities in March and then in late summer for the public to provide input on this study. So the next slide, Wes. This slide is about our historic properties. We just wanted to touch on that. The National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106 of that act, requires that a federal agency consider its potential to adversely impact historic properties. So we work in consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office and the public, as well as significant stakeholders. And in Charleston, we've got the Historic Charleston Foundation, Charleston Historical Preservation Society. I'm sorry, we have been at the table with all of them throughout this process. And so I mentioned that we're developing a programmatic agreement. We just recently sent out a revised version of that to all of these stakeholders who will be signatories on it. They all have a say in how we will treat the potential adverse effects to historic properties, and have input on how we can avoid, minimize, and mitigate those impacts as we go through the process. So right now, the programmatic agreement, which is, like I said, part of our report and part of our package that the public will see, describes the process by which all of these stakeholders will be able to provide their input on how we identify the properties and then deal with potential for impacts and through, like I say, avoidance, minimization, and mitigation. And that process, that agreement we sign now, is in effect through the end of construction. So all along the way, through design and through construction, we rely on that documentation and that process to guide how we deal with historic properties. So the next slide is back to Wes.
Thanks, Nancy. All right. Thanks, Nancy. This is the final E of our optimization efforts, so the economics part. So I know you see a lot of numbers there, and I'll walk you through the first table on the top. So the table on the top, we analyzed 3 different wall elevations to see which one would give us the highest net benefits. As you can see, the cost to go from a 7-foot wall to a 12-foot wall is not linear increase compared to the benefits. So one of the things the federal government does is we look for the biggest bang for our buck, meaning the highest net benefits or the National Economic Development Plan, which we've mentioned before. This is what the federal government will invest in and a portion of what we will pay for. The city can make changes at their own expense as long as it doesn't reduce the benefits. So this is, as you can see, we go through a very detailed process to determine the level of federal investment in regards to the net benefits. The economics team determined that we do have one based on our current BCR of 2.3. However, based on our engineering optimization that we've done to date, the results of moving the combo wall to high ground, we are expecting that BCR to increase as costs go down. Those costs in BCR will be updated by the release of the report that Nancy mentioned in the late summer of 2021. We still need to refine our mitigation costs for wetland, cultural, and the visual impacts and update the real estate estimates based on our latest alignment. And that analysis is ongoing. And then, Mayor, Mark, my final slide here is, where are we going from here? Short term, we've got a programmatic agreement currently being reviewed by the City of Charleston and other consulting parties, such as Historic Charleston and Preservation Society, SHPO, and National Park Service, and others. This is a binding legal agreement, and we are currently in the review process and making edits to that document right now. As Nancy mentioned, we are hopeful for a approval of that waiver in a March 2021 public meeting. We released the report in the late summer of 2021. We envision, hopefully we're at the virtual world by then, but who knows? We could do some face-to-face public meetings and workshops in September. And then in November, the city is required as part of our final package to submit a self-financial certification and a letter supporting the recommended plan. In the spring of 2022, we will have one more state agency review for 30 days. This is not a formal comment period. However, the public will have access and is encouraged to read the report to see how their comments were addressed. And then I threw out some long-term dates there. Before we enter the 2023, 2024, 2025 stage, we need to enter into another partnering agreement with the city that will detail cost and process for the design phase. So at the very, 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 very earliest, 2023, we would anticipate needing cost share funding from the City of Charleston for design. And if we only do phase 1 design, that's mentioned earlier, that was from Coast Guard to Coast Guard to Behind the Joe. We request funding by year. So year 1 would be between 1 and 3 million, year 2, 3 and 5 million. And those estimates are rough right now. I mean, we're 3-4 years away from that. So they will be further refined as we get closer to those dates.
A question was,
now, yes.
This is Councilman Mitchell. I know we were talking about the west side and downtown, but are we throwing away what's happening on the east side of town?
No, the east side is still, that is phase 3 of our of our recommendation. And that would be to go from the high battery wall all the way up and to tie in Upper Morrison area.
Because, I was keep hearing the west side and down, upper downtown, and the people are wondering, say, every time we look, they're always the last, and which is the low income areas. They always figure they're the last on the totem pole to get anything done, and they are very, very adamant about that on the east side of the peninsula, because it floods there pretty bad. Even the water's right there. The Cooper River is right there. So they're, were asking me about that. And, sometimes they're not going on the line to read that big manual and these things. So, that was one of my big concern. And I know we're talking about
Yes, sir.
The west side and the Joe and the face so far as the Westfield building on Morrison Drive, building back in that area now.
Yes.
But the east side was always being, to me, left to the last, to the end. And that's one thing that I'm very adamant about, since I'm in that area now, representing that area. You see, so, and the people there is adamant about that too, because they always feel left out. They always feel that when anything happens, they get the end of the stick most of the time. You see, and we know we flooded very bad there, even up to the place that I mentioned to them before, the old Bayside. When the storm comes, you can't even get in or out in that area. Either way, because we tried to just flood it out. When the storm comes, you can't even get in or out. So it's a safety problem there too. Because if someone is sick, you can't get in there to get them out. If whatever happens, you can't get them out of there. Just on a normal storm with flood, because the ocean is right there behind them. So all these things I'm looking at. So I keep hearing the report. We are starting this area and coming down, and then the second phase, our third phase, is going to be coming on the east side. We got to start looking at that very carefully now and start changing some of these ramifications of what we're doing. That's just my take on it.
Council member,
Yes, sir.
this is Mark Wilbert. Just very quickly, you'll hear later on in the presentation today from the Wagner Ball team that one of the things that they were looking at, and we've already talked to the Corps about this, is the possibility of moving 3 to number 2. There may be some safety concerns with that we've got to look at closer, but just to let you know that point's not lost on us.
Hey, Mark,
And sir, in an ideal world, we would like to construct the entire project at one time instead of phases. But we all know, sir, the funding doesn't typically line up like that. So as Mark pointed out, we could, there are some opportunities to relook at 2 and 3 and the impacts we would have if we could switch those around. Over.
This is Gregory. Could you talk a little about Wagner Terrace for me? Phase 4, and what effects we need to anticipate accordingly?
All right. Would it be more helpful if I went back to the alignment slide to talk about it? Okay. Yes, sir. So the alignment for phase 4 would be from the Citadel and then around Wagner Terrace offshore, and then back on shore and tying into right around I-26.
Okay.
That would be considered phase 4 if we go through a phased construction approach and we're not funded all at one time.
And what effects would the other phases have on phase 4 as construction occurs?
Right. So there would be, so the reason that we're tying in at this location, right, and the tie-in at this location is because that's the natural tie-in at the 12-foot elevation of what our wall would protect against or reduce the risk of damages against.
So constructing the wall in these other phases, if we left it at 1, 2, 3, and Wagner Terrace is 4, the presence of the wall in those other places is not going to increase the risk at Wagner Terrace. It's not going to change anything for Wagner Terrace from what they experience now. So we're not going to increase their risk in the interim before we get to them. Is that what you're asking?
Exactly. And thanks for that answer.
let me ask a question now. This is Keith Waring. Give us a feel if you're on ground level now at again in Wagner Terrace and we driving towards the marsh. So if we're at the end of Grove Street or St. Margaret Street, how high is this wall from the ground level looking up?
So the question, I guess, is based on where you are on Wagner Terrace, based,
Right.
you know, whether you're on a 5 foot, 7 feet high ground, 9 feet high ground. It truly depends on where you're standing.
Well, if it's easier for you to pick a spot, and I think we all probably know where it is, can you pick a spot at the end of one of the streets?
Yeah. I think, can you guys see my mouse there?
I can.
I'm not sure if you can see it, but towards the Citadel there. If you're standing on five feet, you know, you've got a 12-foot wall out there. It's a 7-foot difference. And it's also based on tide too, on what you see. You know, the higher tide, the less wall you'll see. But you know, there will be some visual impacts on Wagner Terrace.
This is Councilmember Sacron. I guess I do need some clarification to Councilmember Waring's question. So if you are sitting down near the end of Grove Street, which is, I can't remember the name of it, Lowndes Grove Plantation, and you're sitting literally right there at the marsh, and you're looking out to that marsh view, how far out from that point is the wall going to be constructed?
Right now, we're assuming 35 feet from the marsh edge. I'm sorry, from the edge of high ground.
Okay, so that's considerable.
Maybe further.
Okay, but if you're at the edge of Grove Street and you're looking out, that's a considerable obstruction to the view.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Wes, didn't you have one map that showed variations in color of the wall that indicated?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was it.
Yes, sir. Okay.
And that's very hard to see, but it's still, you're right, particularly at Wagner Terrace, it's a tall wall because it's out in the water. And as Wes said, when the tide is high, like more of the wall is underwater, you know, so it looks shorter. And it's not terribly far offshore, so it is an obstruction. And that is part of this view shed analysis that I was talking about, that we're working towards determining what kind of impact that has and what we can do to help mitigate that without leaving this population at risk for inundation. You know, we're trying to balance those things.
This is Gregory. I'd just like to follow up. Are you doing an analysis to determine how this may affect property values? Well, I'm still talking Wagner Terrace.
I think the answer to that question
We
is
don't.
Councilman.
No, we don't. The Corps does not do any real estate analysis on property values.
Okay, but at some point will then that's left up to the client then, I would suspect, which would be the city.
Yes, sir. I mean, the city has that option.
Yeah, why I'm raising the question is because it's an obvious one, of which most of our constituents, Sacron and I, will be asking us, and we're going to have to be able to respond accordingly. So I don't know where we go to find that out, and I know phase 4 is way down the line, but I think that people are going to want to also consider how do they protect their interests in terms of property value.
Right. I hear you, and a lot of thought will go into that, council member, but at the end of the day, over the long haul, you're going to retain property value by the fact that it will be dry as opposed to flooded. So that is one long-term consideration. Council member Shade.
Thank you, Mayor. And sort of along those same lines of questioning, And I heard you say, maybe I just didn't pick up on this, but as you were going through this analysis of the benefits of this wall and how it's going to impact in the event of a storm or a surge of some sort, what is those numbers? I mean, how significant of a difference is that going to be? If we have, and I saw the cost and damages reduced, but I mean, how do you put a value on all of that? I saw this slide, that how are you able to calculate the damage reduction on that? I mean, what is the basis of all that?
Right, I can try to explain that question. So essentially, we obtained all the structural and content inventory on the city of Charleston, and we loaded that into our economics model. And the economics team ran 25 statistical storms through that model to determine, they're all different types of storms, they don't all hit Charleston, to determine damages over a 50-year study period, right? So that if you build a 12-foot wall, you're reducing damages by $4 billion. If you do nothing, obviously you don't have anything.
Stop at that point right there, just so I'm clear on this. If we build a 12-foot wall, are you saying with one storm we're going to save $4 billion?
No, it's a statistical storm analysis. So I mean, you could have 3-4 storms impact the peninsula over a 50-year period. You could have one storm that provides that amount of damages. It's an economics model that calculates what the damage is reduced over a 50-year period, and that's based on your structural and content inventory you have right now.
I'm sorry, maybe I'm just misunderstanding this, and I'm sorry if I'm asking too basic a question. The $4 billion savings with a 12-foot wall is based on off of a 50-year time frame of savings?
That's correct. 50-year estimate.
A 50-year estimate. So how are you, what I'm trying to use, you've got to expostulate over a 50-year period of time per storm that's going to happen per year, or several storms that are going to happen per year.
Or you may not get a storm for 10 years, but you get the big one. And that's how the statistical storm analysis is done in that economics model.
Okay.
Councilmember Sacklin?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, Dudley.
Yes.
One more question. I guess the ultimate question that, if I'm living in Wagner Terrace and I'm at that, Lowndes Grove or really anywhere along that, am I going to be able to see over the wall? And maybe it's premature to answer that, but is there a way to get a model of this? Go ahead.
I think Nancy alluded to that a little bit, and that's one of the reasons we're doing that visual impact analysis, is to determine what those impacts are at strategic locations. That's part of the environmental impact assessment that we're doing. So we are in the middle of that analysis right now, but I'm sure there will be some impacts, and we'll just have to figure out how to mitigate for them.
So I would say, for example, the high battery wall now is what, Wes, it's at 9 feet of elevation. And when you're standing down there, at the tip of the peninsula, you can still see the water over that wall. And obviously, the closer you get to the wall, the less you can see.
Right.
But if you're in the park, I mean, you can see the whole harbor, right? So it's a matter of perspective. So yes, of course, if you are at the end of the street and you are right at the edge of the land, you're closest to the wall, you're going to see more wall than you're going to see Ashley River. And as you back off from it, you gain that perspective, and certainly you gain some height and elevation as you come inland. You're kind of going uphill, and you can see out across it. So it's not the complete block of any view whatsoever, but certainly there are going to be vantage points where your view is going to be greatly diminished. And as the mayor said earlier, it's kind of the trade-off between that and getting flooded, right? I mean, it's not going to be as dramatic as it sounds, but yes, there will be some visual impacts. And so part of this EIS that we're doing is exploring what those impacts are, and then through our design phase and into construction, we will work on ways to minimize those impacts, you know, to provide some relief from that.
Thank you.
And then the other question I have along those lines, you going 35 feet out from the high water mark?
Yeah, that 35 feet is the minimum that we would go out, but that would be from, I guess, the very end of high ground there on certain parts of the Wagner Terrace area.
And how's that going to impact navigation of the Ashley River?
We'll still be in the marsh in regards to 35 feet out would still be considered in the marsh.
Councilmember Waring, did you have your hand up again?
I did. So when this thing rolls out, who actually, I guess, decides? And I'm gonna kind of compare it to the vaccine. You know, some people want to take the vaccine when I think of neighbors, and some people, for whatever reason, they're not gonna take it. You know, I'm of the ilk where I took my first shot anyway. I'm looking forward to the second. How much of a voice? I know we're gonna have these public hearings, but how much of an impact if I don't live down there, but if I did, I'd say, well, listen, I don't mind the wall, and my next door neighbor says, I don't want my view blocked. How much of a voice does that next door neighbor have?
So the decision, so the decision ultimately lies with the non-federal sponsor, the city of Charleston, on whether you want to move forward with this recommendation or not. And Nancy, chime in there if I didn't.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a decision that the city has to make, and however the city chooses to, you know, involve the council and the public in making that decision. That's not for the federal government.
Okay, I got you.
Hey,
Well,
Wes,
it's not a popular vote of the citizens, basically. The decision's going to be made by the mayor and the 12 council people.
Wes, I know we're getting short on time here, but I think one thing that would be important for this segment, if we could just spend 30 seconds just letting council know the work we did up in Wagner Terrace because of the concerns that they've already raised about Wagner Terrace. And that was that we looked at, as a group, taking Wagner Terrace out of the project, and two, looking to go in with all non-structural solutions of Wagner Terrace, which would do away with the wall, but raise every home in Wagner Terrace. So both of those things were looked at, and essentially what happened was because of the cost, because of the benefits, because of the level of protection, Wagner Terrace would not be getting the same level of protection as the rest of the city, which is one of the criteria that the Corps has for moving forward. So this is a great discussion because you're asking the questions that we've asked and worked through. Again, Wagner Terrace is severable as we go through this next 9 or 10 months, if that was something the council wanted to do either now or later on in the process over these issues. So we're in that stage. These are great questions. This is why we wanted to do a workshop, because we need to get these questions.
That's great, but let me follow up, please.
Can
I represent an area west, actually a number of us on here do.
Mhm.
What kind of feedback we're going to get with the results of, if this wall's put around the peninsula, what are going to be the results for west of the Ashley, James Island, and maybe to a lesser extent, Johns Island being farther away, but anybody studying that?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. And those results, we had hoped to have them, let me back up. The Army Corps and West team had hoped to have them today. They're just backed up in the computer backlog. We will bring those to you when they are finished. That is a promise we've made, and those will come to you when they're done.
All right, thank you.
Wes, I don't want to speak for your organization, but you really can't move forward until those are done, right? They have to be done and they have to be satisfied.
Exactly. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, we're running those models right now. As soon as we have that impact determination, If we do have any at all, we will come back to Mark and council and figure out how we can best present it. If there are issues and we have impacts to the west of Ashley and other areas, we cannot move forward without recommendation, without a concrete mitigation plan. So at the end of the day, we need to do this modeling, and we are doing it right now.
Hey, Mark, this is Dudley. This is Gregory. And I want to go back to my original question. If we can project that within a 50-year period, damages will be X, somewhere we had to assert a value. And then that value, I would suspect, can be akin to property value in Wagner Terrace. This is going to be a question that Saccharin and I are going to have to be able to answer. And I'm not clear whether or not I can yet. So my question is, if we can assess what the damage will be within a 50-year period, don't we need to know what values are now and how they will be projected during that period? And as a result of knowing that, if we knew a little more specifics, Councilman Saccharin and I may be able to answer that very important question. So I'm just being consistent and trying to be logical here. And I understand that they'll be drier, stay dry, but some will argue we're dry now. So I still raise that question of how we're going to be able to determine and assess that value.
Can I make an offer here? And Wes, again, I'm jumping out front of you. Can I make an offer that we will do a more in-depth economic analysis explanation to anybody that wants it in the future?
I would appreciate that.
I will tell you, the most amazing thing for me being in this study is going through those economic meetings. They were just great. So I see Dale smiling there, but we'll be happy to do that, I think, right, Wes? I think the team would be willing to do that.
Yeah.
I
think I know a guy who's happy to do it.
I know a guy. Yeah, I was going to suggest the same thing, Mark. Yep.
Okay.
Councilmember Saccharin, and then maybe we could move on to the next part of the program.
Thank you, Mayor. Just one quick question to add to Dudley's. Maybe you all have the answer to this. Flood insurance. Would there be a direct benefit to our flood insurance premiums if the wall gets erected?
That's a FEMA
so
thing.
the Corps doesn't control those. That's the FEMA does all the flood insurance, so we wouldn't be able to answer that question.
Ever or just right now?
It would seem to me we would qualify for all kind of community rating system points. But we could ask Stephen Jolka to check with FEMA on that question.
Thank you.
Okay. So Wes, Nancy, thank you so much. 20,000 hours worth of work so far, and we've got a little ways to go. Y'all, I think, I don't know that council really realizes the importance of this pivot to the environmental impact statement in terms of our citizens being able to have additional input and address all these issues that we've been talking about today. I think it's a great addition to the study. I guess it's going to turn it from a 3x3 to more like a 4x4.
Almost.
something like that. So thank you for being with us today, for the update, for all the incredible work you're doing. And we look forward to the year ahead as we continue on. Back to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you, Mayor, and thank you again to the Army Corps team. Right now, what I'd like to do is introduce David Wagner, a man who really does not need an introduction in the city of Charleston, but I'm going to give him one anyway. He and his team, who he'll introduce, will walk you through their discovery report, which, as you remember, City Council helped to fund along with some private funders in the city as well. David.
Yes, thank you, council members, and thank you for the funding support. Thank you for also there were some private parties who brought us in. You know, I'm here today with Andy Sternad's actually going to present our discovery report. We've been working with the Corps with their cooperation with Wes and Nancy as well as Sarah. But We're here with Dale Morris, who's been our thought partner in this all along. You know, Dale has unique advantages, understanding Washington, understanding the government, coming from a idealized model of water management in the Dutch situation. We've been in Charleston. I'm glad to know people know us. I hope they think well. We've been fortunate since we were at Clemson for Dutch dialogues with Ray, Huff, and Beatty before and doing the Dutch dialogues. You know, at that point, our probably deepest recommendation with respect to the peninsula was that you need a polar plan. You know, over time, the situation is changing with respect to the peninsula, its elevation against the water. So we've been fortunate during these months to work with the city, its really committed staff. And we had a workshop in late November where the Corps and some of the key parties were able to talk to one another. We risked the COVID thing. But what we've been trying to do is get to a point like today where we can talk to you and you can ask the questions you're asking, these very good questions. The reason this is occurring is because of the funding. The city got funding for this without its own contribution, which is beneficial in many ways, and this huge level of investment. This is a mega scale question, you know, but it's also got to be a whole city, whole water approach. You know, it can't be thought of only as perimeter, even protection, because it's really perimeter management, edge management. It's really peninsula operation. How are you going to stay here on that beautiful spit of land? And how are you going to stay here as the sea is coming in and you're not really going to keep all the water out? There's an overtopping piece of this that's really important. There's a, you know, it's really an edge we're talking about. But, you know, I'll say before Andy, you know, when I look at Charleston, I think how beautiful. I had that experience in Prague, and I thought in Prague, only a king could have made this city. You know, the Netherlands, Amsterdam is made by a king. You were the king's city. So you're also the holy city, and you can't be a holy city without the community. So I think the opportunity going forward is to involve the citizens, you know, the stakeholders, the leadership. So this polar plan is really becoming a polar model, all of which is embedded history lessons from my 15 years with the Dutch. But, you know, I think we have to aspire to the best thing we can do in Charleston, and Charleston deserves the best thing. So Andy, you want to explain the report?
Thank you, David.
All right, thank you, David, and thank you, Mayor and Mark and Council and everyone for being here and listening today. We've had the opportunity to work closely with city staff over the last 2 or 3 months, 4 months or so, just since the end of October. And our purpose was really to help understand some of these complicated factors in the Army Corps' process and help propose a possible design approach moving forward. How the city might wrap in other factors into this process that the Corps can't directly address itself. They're nonetheless vitally important. So I'm going to take you through today. I'm going to take you through a bunch of slides quickly, and then would welcome any questions, and this definitely merits further study. Our discovery report will be available in the very near future to you and to the public. This is a summary first of what we saw, then some of the questions we asked and some ideas. And at the end, I'll wrap up with some recommendations, preliminary recommendations that we've made to the city. So to begin, just to understand the risk, on the left, you see a map of the depth of storm surge in category 3. On the right, sea level rise, a 3-foot projection in the future. I think a fundamental point and recommendation is that the future is not either or of these two scenarios, it's both and that any solution moving forward for the perimeter must address both. And these
Sorry to interrupt you. I'm getting a little static there from your microphone or your audio. Are you all getting that too?
Is that better?
I think so. Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's better, Andy. Yep.
Okay, well, I'll go this way. I'll just restate then. These two risks, storm surge mapped on the left and 3 foot of sea level rise mapped on the right, are not an either or scenario. It's a both and these risks are both growing over time and increase cumulatively over time. So any peninsula perimeter has to address them both. The Army Corps study is specifically focused on storm surge and coastal risk reduction. They have accounted for some degree of sea level rise, but the design of the system is not directly oriented toward that daily creeping tidal basis. So there may be some additional questions and some additional opportunities the city needs to raise through the process. I've got 2 text-heavy slides here, and then I'll show you a lot of pictures. Just observations of the perimeter context and what protection means. Sea level rise moving forward will require some type of perimeter edge protection. The city's sea level rise strategy anticipates 2 to 3 feet of rise in the next 50 years. That was what's shown on the previous map. Storm surge protection is, it will be necessary. It's kind of a black swan event, but it can be devastating, especially with sea level rise compounding the problem. These 2 factors together result in something like a Dutch polder model for the peninsula. The polder is a self-contained water management unit. All aspects of maintenance and operations, city systems are oriented towards maintaining the unity of that basin. Number 3, the 50-year storm, which is what the Corps' projections are based on, the 2% recurrence event, is a relatively low standard compared to other cities and other places around the country. In New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina, $14 billion was invested for a 1 in 100 year storm event, with a 100-year storm, 1% chance, with the corresponding reduction in insurance rates within the system. On Staten Island, for example, it's a 300-year event being planned currently. And I'll note to the point earlier about how the system pays for itself. In New Orleans, Hurricane Isaac in 2012 paid for the $14 billion investment in one storm, just a handful of years after it was complete. So the larger storms are possible. The returns are possible. Number 4, the multiple lines of defense strategy. The project being considered now and studied with the Army Corps is primarily one line of defense. It's not to say that the city shouldn't invest in and consider more lines. I'll explain a little more about what that might look like, what it might mean over time. And number 5, the city has a head start in a way. There are many, many projects underway. Mark mentioned the interior drainage work that's progressing, the check valves, and many plans. The vulnerability analysis in particular and risk assessment is world-class, recently completed in Charleston. The comprehensive plan update, which is underway as well. All of these things are working to address these risks, address this planning, but some revision and coordination we think will be needed within those existing efforts, anticipating that raised edge. Most of them are oriented toward the existing condition without. Okay, a couple of observations about the Army Corps process, outcomes to expect. First, the city needs holistic water management, but should not expect that from the Army Corps process. The process is very clearly focused on coastal storm surge risk reduction. There are many other factors, interior hydrology and ecological environmental factors, real estate development that should be considered in that holistic approach. And that's not meant as a criticism of the Corps' process. It's just that process is highly specific. Number 2, the Charleston 3x3 study is fully federally funded. That's good in that the city doesn't have to pay for it right now. It doesn't have to split the share of that $3 million. It's potentially unique though, in that the city has less leverage through this current study than other cities, which typically share the cost as an equal partner. So it's a blessing and a curse there. The city may have lost a little bit of leverage. Part of the study may be eligible for state support. We think there are state level impacts around the peninsula, including the ports, which are state-owned, Palmetto Rail, the medical district, especially properties there of import for the wider region and state. Number 4, the Corps' benefit cost ratio excludes some assets and costs which are real to the city. And this is by regulation, and it's just a point here to understand what those exclusions are and what they mean. Just a couple of examples. The transient cargo that sits at the port before it is shipped is excluded from the cost benefit calculation. I'll get into that a little more later. In addition, the future real estate value around the perimeter and future real estate value impacts, like Wes was mentioning, are excluded from that calculation. Finally, structures that are raised above the floodplain, the value of those structures are excluded, even if access to and from those structures may be impeded by flooding. So again, not a criticism of the Corps' BCR. It's just important to understand these factors and how the city incorporates them going forward in its own decision-making. Number 5 here, just to note, mitigations are cost shared. Betterments are paid by the city. This is the importance of the EIS coming up now. There's an opportunity to define impacts and define mitigation approaches so that those impacts are cost shared rather than falling on the city. Couldn't emphasize that enough, the importance of the EIS. Number 6, movable and temporary should be considered red flags as far as risk and reliability. These structures depend on a staff to maintain and operate them in those emergency situations. So just one more potential failure point. They also concentrate risk to these movable areas versus the static structures that may be more likely to fail. But really, that's a point about human error, primarily in operating these movable and temporary features. Significant changes are expected in PED phase. The Corps will go through its own design process and revise and review. Again, this is just a feasibility study, as Wes and Nancy have said. But the parameters are set now. That's why it's important to get them right through the EIS and other types of engagement with the Corps, continued engagement. Number 8, the cost share and design and construction occurs in phases. So the city will need to make a financial commitment and a statement of support in November this year. I'll get to this again a moment later. There's a financial commitment at this early stage in November. However, the actual cost share occurs in phases, and there may be opportunities in the future for the city to choose not to proceed with some of those phases. So even though the commitment up front has to be made, it may play out in different scenarios. Number 9, if the city chooses to proceed with this process with the Corps, there may be some other short-term benefits. Those include local economic stimulus. This occurs because the city's cost share portion can in part take the form of professional services. The city can pay its own design consultants, its own engineers to work with the Corps. Those consultants can be local. The B here, significant survey and geotechnical data will be produced through PED phase, that early preliminary engineering and design phase. That really detailed soil and survey data could be useful in many ways to the city around the perimeter. And finally, and then I'll get to the pictures here, number 10, if the city chooses not to proceed with the Corps' process, either now or in the future, there are certain trade-offs to consider. A loss of momentum for resilience. There is no other federal funding currently on the horizon for Charleston to address these issues, surge and sea level rise. B, the risks continue to grow. C, an incomplete system. If a storm were to strike and things are not fully in place, there may be disproportionate impacts to parts of the city versus others. And phasing is important there. D, potentially rapid post-disaster implementation. This means that if a study is approved and is sitting on the shelf ready to be funded at the federal level and a major disaster strikes, that plan may suddenly happen and be federally funded all at once, rather than over this 5, 8, 10-year cycle that is laid out right now. That means it's especially more important to get the factors right in the plan at every stage, just in case. And finally here, an acceleration of private sector flood retrofits in the absence of a city plan. What this means, and why this is potentially a trade-off, is that if the city does not act and the federal government does not act, flood mitigation falls to the private sector. People will raise their own homes and buildings over time. Then if this project is approached again in the future, like I mentioned earlier, those raised properties and the value of those raised properties will be excluded from future cost-benefit ratios. That means that paradoxically, the value that people invest in resilience on their own may result in a smaller BCR in the future and make the overall project harder to do. It's kind of complicated, but it's important just to understand that consequence in time and value. Okay. That was a lot of information, I know, but I'll go through now our process, some design criteria, and then around each of these segments in a little more detail. Hopefully address some questions that you may be having now. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
I think in the first line of what you just presented to us, you were making it clear that it's not a solution for holistic water management. And Mayor and Councilman Seekings and Wilbur, we all know that when we went to Amsterdam, as well as one of the recommendations from the Dutch dialogue was for us to do a holistic water plan. And this is probably not a question for you, but probably one for us. Are we, in fact, at some point, going to take a holistic approach to water management, be it sea level rise, tidal, or otherwise, that would not just be limited to the peninsula, but such a holistic water management plan would be applicable to the entire city? I know that we're doing a comprehensive plan where we will have some provisions in it for water. But my question, I guess, to us is, at some point, are we going to follow through with the Dutch dialogue recommendation, as well as what we experienced when we were in Amsterdam? And that is the need for an overall water plan that is holistic to water management in the city of Charleston.
I think Andy's going to get to that, and it's going to be one of his recommendations in just a few minutes, right, Andy?
I'll get there. And I would also add that a lot of the pieces are in place. This is one important piece. And so it then becomes incumbent on the city to wrap them together. That might need a little bit more perspective, but between those, Councilman, the plans that you mentioned, in addition to the vulnerability analysis, is some of the pieces are out there.
I agree. Just wanted to make sure we were headed that way. Thank you.
Okay. So where we're headed with our analysis here over the next few slides is trying to understand the perimeter, not as a single line, but as an alignment zone. And so we've tried to, the Corps has gone through multiple different alignments and studies as well. What we're trying to do, big picture, is open up the menu of options for the city, both within the Corps process and additional options that may be added on or occur later, but that are nonetheless part of that holistic approach. So I'll explain now kind of what this orange zone around the edge means. What are some of the consequences for inside? And then we'll go segment by segment. Okay, so we began this analysis with 5 design criteria, looking at risk management. So that means, what is the wall height? What is the level of protection it provides? How does that change? What is the wall type? How much water could be expected to come over it? if a bigger event happens than what is bigger than a 50-year event. Now, we looked at internal water, how this perimeter factors in with water management in the rest of the city, in the rest of the peninsula. Ecology, what happens to the marsh at the edge? What is happening to that marsh over time? What happens if it ends up inside a structure? What are the consequences for mitigation? And what are the values of nature-based solutions that we might be able to add? And we looked at operations and maintenance. What does that look like on an annual basis? What are some red flags? Who will perform those operations and maintenance? What organization? And finally, last but not least, urban design and historic preservation. That's coming here as number 5 because the other 4 create the context for that urban design, those functional characteristics of all these other 4. Not to diminish urban design or history in any way, that's part of Charleston's essential character. And all of these 4 other aspects need to be holistically approached to preserve that character. Okay, I'll just go quickly one slide for each of those. Risk management and internal water was primarily the focus of Moffitt Nickel and our team, a preeminent national engineering firm for coastal projects. They looked at a series of storms beyond that 50-year event, what that means for water levels and potentially water that comes over the wall. That's not considered a failure of the structure. That's just something that has to be designed for. What happens if you get a bigger storm and water comes over? Also, adaptability, what happens over time? We know as sea levels rise, those water levels are rising. And so the structure needs to plan for that adaptability at this early phase, whether that means larger foundations or other types of design, multi-layers, consider adaptability. Wave overtopping, the number of models Moffitt Nickel ran at a high-level concept analysis, just to get a sense of what that overtopping might mean, whether the city's drainage system can handle it. This is also part of the Corps' hydrology study that we hear was forthcoming. And then finally, the polar concept for all of the water together. When you're inside a raised perimeter, when you're inside the teacup, you all need to work together, and all of this water factors and urban factors like transportation, recreation, influence one another and present opportunities, and they can be considered together. Ecology, we looked at what happens to marsh migration as sea level rises. There's a question here about the state regulatory framework. It's a question across the country. How does the regulatory framework to protect our environment keep up with the changes that are occurring in that environment? Marsh migrates and moves and goes extinct in some places, grows in others as sea level rises. How do regulations keep up with that? How do we avoid a situation where we pay for marsh mitigation in a place that marsh will cease to exist in the near future? Again, making wise investments, thinking through that. That has to be a conversation with the regulatory agencies in the state. Nature-based adaptation in the center here, a photo from Norfolk, Virginia, an ongoing, recently constructed living shoreline. Is there an opportunity for some of these features in addition to the structure and maybe in place? In an example like Wagner Terrace, maybe the residents there through community engagement process would decide on a different approach, something like this. There's time for that based on the late phase and maybe an opportunity. I'll get back to there. And finally, tidal flow. How does this, let's imagine that the structure does capture some wetlands inside wetlands and marsh. What happens? How do we sustain those wetlands, in fact, and help them potentially grow rather than succumb to sea level rise through thin layer dredge disposal and things, the types of science like that that's being studied in Charleston right now. Okay, operations and maintenance. Just a couple of points here. I mentioned the red flags about movable and temporary. Here you see in the photo, this is an example from the New Orleans hurricane system at Lake Pontchartrain. That's about a 5 to 6 foot high swing gate on top of a levee, but it's perceived as about a 5 to 6 foot gate. Somebody has to go out there and close that thing and make sure it's working and make sure that it's sealed up tight before any major storm. The more of these you have, the more failure points you have, the more likely it can go wrong. Somebody might not get there in time. Something might not work in that moment of critical need. One recommendation we make is to avoid every single gate that you possibly can, over railroads, over roads, for all types, and just increase that factor of redundancy. Annual costs, this depends on the lifespan, of the projected lifespan of the system, how those will be maintained. In a 50-year system, you could expect a 2%, or say around a 2% annual maintenance cost. That means the structure has to pay for its own replacement over 50 years. You can imagine it that way. If the structure were designed for 100 years, 1% annual cost. That cost has to come from somewhere and fund something like a management authority. In Louisiana, that's the Southeast Louisiana Flood Protection Authority. That's an organization the Corps works with routinely here in close collaboration for some of these big flood protection structures. But it takes a dedicated staff and a dedicated budget. It may be difficult to wrap that into existing city departments. That's a question for the city to investigate. Finally, the last criteria, urban design. We worked closely with the design division, and Alan Davis has done a lot of study all the way around the peninsula, documenting and understanding these potential visual impacts, historical impacts, other kinds of urban design factors. These become critical now as the EIS begins to define what those impacts are and look for ways to cost share in their mitigation. Transportation, again, removing those gates. It's not only an operations and maintenance question, it becomes something about safety and preserving the function of traffic on the peninsula. There are a couple of gates currently located as in the feasibility study with the Corps crossing Lockwood. We can talk about what those trade-offs are in just a minute. And then finally, recreation, opportunities to use this structure and its investment to improve and extend recreation opportunities around the peninsula. Maybe extending Waterfront Park, considering a holistic perimeter park, something that's publicly accessible. Okay, I'm getting ready to, in a minute here, go around the edge, segment by segment, but I'll just give you a sense of what the alignment zone means, first of all. Here's where we began with the Corps' optimized alignment map that we created, just reflecting that alignment against topography. You see in particular the change around the Citadel, where that red line, the red feasibility alignment, plugs into high ground in brown around the Citadel. So here's that Corps' line, optimized line. We consider that the inner alignment. That's about as far in towards the city as you can go before you start to really impact roads and buildings. So it's been cinched up. And one of the drivers there was in the Corps working with the state regulatory agencies to avoid marsh impacts. That's a valuable goal, but we need to understand the trade-offs. So the Corps' optimized alignment, we consider the innermost alignment. We've worked to develop what the outermost alignment might be as a concept based on depth of the water, the bathymetry, the existing conditions out there at the edge. And that intermediate zone becomes the alignment zone. That's where we recommend for the city and the Corps to work together to define where this thing should go moving through PED phase. That's something that will be developed in the future. You'll see in the map on the left that hatched area around the Citadel Marsh and Wagner Terrace. That's that opportunity, given the extensive marsh at the edge in that area, to consider alternative approaches. It's something I'll get back to here in a minute, but recommend a community conversation about that, what the trade-offs mean. So the Corps has segmented the perimeter into phases. So we're just reflecting those here, and that's will be the basis of our segment analysis. Phase 1 is currently projected as the Lockwood corridor. So as Wes mentioned, from the Joe down to the Coast Guard Station. Phase 2, the low and high batteries, moving around towards Waterfront Park. Phase 3 for the Corps is the whole east side, up from Cooper Hotel or so, up to Newmarket Creek, all the way up the east side. We think maybe there's an opportunity to break that down a little bit and consider the ports as a different condition, different scale of stakeholder. And then phase 4 currently projected in PED as Wagner Terrace far into the future. We think there's an opportunity to consider that Mark alluded to swap phase 2 and 3 here. The low and high battery provides some level of protection currently, whereas other areas like Lockwood and the east side around Newmarket Creek don't have any protection currently. So that might be an opportunity there to build incrementally and equalize that risk as the project goes along. So within, what to focus on here is that darker red shaded area. Within that alignment zone that we defined, we're zooming in on one potential alternative alignment, one potential option. And so that's the basis of where I'll take you around the perimeter now. Okay, then just a note about multiple lines of defense and what that might look like in Charleston. So you have the perimeter protection there, the structure, whatever that may become. But it's important to consider what happens outside in terms of wave attenuation. It can help mitigate some overtopping, maybe provide an opportunity for marshes to accrete and stabilize as sea levels rise. What happens inside the wall is also part of these layers and lines of defense, from structural adaptation, raising roads and buildings, to stormwater storage, to the deep tunnels, and to the pump system, which is going to tie together all of those things. How does that all work together? That should be part of this defensive integrated thinking. Okay, alignment options now going around. We'll start with phase one, PED phase one on Lockwood. If you focus in here around the James Island connector interchange, just to start, the darker red line here is the Corps' optimized alignment. Again, it's the feasibility alignment, has not been fully designed. But there are two gates crossing Lockwood. Outside the hospital here and then farther down towards Long Lake. And then the alignment is drawn below the James Island connector here. These are two of those gates which raise a red flag for us, which we recommend considering ways to eliminate in the future. Those gates would currently swing across Lockwood or be designed in some fashion to cross Lockwood. As sea levels rise over time, those gates may be closed more often than just a storm surge event. And that's one of the major risks here, that they would cut off traffic flow and other aspects of Lockwood on a more regular basis. The trade-off here versus gates is to shift the alignment farther out. Here we get into the marsh impact question and the conversation with regulatory agencies. It's a trade-off. Elsewhere along Lockwood, we think maybe there's an opportunity to consider a low battery type structure, especially in continuation. That might benefit this recreational loop from the low battery up. And then here's just a diagram of what the Corps' combo wall, just in concept, looks like. There's a sheet pile wall with what's called a batter pile and that concrete cap. That's what is constructed offshore and would be required in an area like this, the trade-off for those gates. And I'll zoom in just there in just a second. So some of these things, these next drawings and sections, I think you might be familiar with. We've showed you before, but this is just trying to capture what that alignment zone means. Not to make a recommendation about one or the other, but to capture this range from all the way the inner alignment currently proposed as optimized along Lockwood, all the way to an outer alignment. And maybe there's an opportunity somewhere in between that's a happy medium. This is that recommendation underneath to avoid the gates, move underneath the James Island connector.
Andy, just real quick, I'm sorry to jump
please.
in. Before I forget, I just wanted to know if y'all had looked at the proposed Ashley River bike ped bridge that we're working so hard on, and to see how this will all interplay with this. I wanted to hit that before we left the Lockwood corridor. Thank you.
Yeah, we didn't address that specifically, and I'm getting a wave here to keep moving because we're running short on time. But it's not. Short answer, yes, and I think it just needs to have future study. That's part of this holistic approach. It's one of it shouldn't be a casualty of this. It's happening. It needs to be wrapped in.
Council member, very quickly, this is Mark. We had the HDR folks along with our city folks along with the Corps had a meeting about 2 weeks ago on that topic. So we are meeting on it already and looking at how we make sure that we don't get in each other's way.
Sounds good. Thanks, y'all.
Okay, so that alignment could go underneath the connector here rather than the gates. Moving down around the low battery, again, just the options. Maybe the inner alignment is preserved here, more of a low battery type construction. Maybe in the future, more like a high battery type construction, but linked, and perhaps a familiar type is possible there. Moving around, a couple of options here at the high battery. The reconstruction of the high battery is currently proposed as part of the optimized alignment. The large wave attenuation structure offshore has been eliminated from the optimized alignment, but there might be value still in other forms. Combo wall offshore is possible here, and maybe a hybrid type that captures some other type of water management or public park space in between. These may be considered betterments from the city. Maybe there's opportunities to fund as partial mitigations for visual impact, for stormwater, et cetera. Here's the former wave attenuation that's now been removed from the cost benefit, but it might come back in a future form. Maybe not this project, just a reference to the Imagine the Wall and some ideas there, but ideas that still have value as part of these multiple lines. Here's the reconstruction aspect versus an outer alignment of combo wall, something can happen in between. Zooming out here, this is a complicated area, how the alignment moves through the park up towards the bottom edge waterfront park. Again, these questions will be raised more specifically in PED phase, but just want to make sure that the concept is there at this level, and want to make sure all the opportunities for alternatives are on the table. Waterfront park, the alignment is currently close into the buildings. There might be some tree and ecological impacts there. That's going through a line of live oaks. Maybe there's an opportunity to elevate a promenade, integrate recreation, and preserve some of that existing ecology. Moving up towards Waterfront Park, here you see through the oak alley versus the promenade option. As we move into the ports, we think there's a fundamental recommendation to shift the alignment as close to the Cooper as possible while still remaining on land. So that's shifting out here towards the back edge of the buildings, back edge of the warehouses on Union Pier. So you see this section's taken a little farther up in Columbus Terminal, but the principle is the same on Union Pier. Avoid the impacts to this constricted zone of street and infrastructure and buildings at the city, and locate the gate closer to the warehouses outboard. That opens, that avoids this complicated alignment along Washington. And at Columbus Street, it protects that transient cargo, which I mentioned is not part of the cost benefit, but is nonetheless crucially valuable for the state's economy. So this is fundamental. The museum district in between is a really tricky spot. I don't have much to advise on this location because it's so difficult and it needs more study where this alignment might go to protect these assets between the two properties. Moving up to Columbus, there you see the outer alignment, which avoids this gate over a road. It avoids a lot of the constriction and impacts to the city along East Bay and Morrison. And then as we move up above in the east side, moving up towards the neck, recommendation to consider avoiding the Morrison impacts. That's this optimized alignment here, and explore what a new alignment might mean outboard of the rail. That's in a location like this. Essentially, this keeps the railroad operation within the line of protection, avoids the gates, streamlines the port protection, and avoids those urban impacts along Morrison. There are some marsh impacts to be explored and some constructability impacts to be explored. Okay, returning to the east side question here about community. These are some of the drawings from the Dutch dialogues, but this is a district approach to thinking here. The wall doesn't only affect the perimeter, it affects Newmarket Creek and some of the internal hydrology specifically. This is one of the zones proposed for a permanent pump station in the course feasibility phase. So engagement is needed here. It's especially important here, whether or not the phases change, and regardless of the alignment. Okay, here you see that here alignment on Morrison, currently the optimized versus an alignment along the rail versus potentially something farther out. Those farther out have consequences and impacts in the marsh mitigation costs in the present, but potentially in the future, that extra internal space captured could help alleviate flooding within the perimeter. It becomes a space for stormwater storage and water management inside the line. All right, moving to Wagner Terrace in the Citadel. Again, far more community engagement is needed here. That's possible since this is considered as phase 4 currently. But it's not projected to happen for a while, even the PED phase for preliminary engineering and design. So impacts to be considered at the Citadel, future growth projected at the Citadel, what happens on that marsh edge needs to be discussed. These are some of the more pristine, high quality marshes moving up around the edge. What happens there? What happens? How do you consider those trade-offs versus marsh impact and visual impact? That's something that just requires much more conversation. This EIS is a beginning. So currently proposed, the red line, 35 feet offshore, as Wes was mentioning, is something like this, a combo wall offshore. Maybe this is an extreme option, moving out to the edge, capture a lot of marsh impact, indirect or direct impact in the marsh. Maybe there's another way, which is primarily nature-based. Maybe it's knocking down some water and adapting buildings on shore in a different way. Something worth talking about with people and residents there. It's particularly possible here because Wagner Terrace is what's called severable from the rest of the plan. You see in the orange, this is a 12-foot high ground, kind of creates a backstop here around Wagner Terrace. So the neighborhood itself is not impacted by what happens in terms of flooding or water levels elsewhere in the city. And at the same time, water levels in Wagner Terrace don't affect anywhere else with a limited closure up by the highway. So this can be thought of as its own unit. What's proposed now, this combo wall, 35 feet offshore, is the most expensive type of perimeter protection the Corps proposes. Like Wes mentioned, 2.5 times more expensive than a T-wall on shore. Is that the right approach? This is a really expensive segment, and are there alternatives? We think that should be a conversation structured by the city. And so here's looking out at that zone, that wide marsh zone from the Lomboro path, inner alignment, which would be 35 feet offshore up to NAVD 12. And this is the far outer alignment. And what else could you do in the interim here that may protect this marsh from sea level rise? Okay, ending with some recommendations. There are only 3 of them. First one is we recommend to proceed incrementally within the Corps' process. Well, the next big milestone is in November here, when the city needs to require the city must provide a financial commitment and a letter of support. It's just one increment. And we see opportunities in increments down the line for the city to reconsider its cost share if it desires, if the project is not meeting its needs. So the risks are great enough, we believe, and the pathways exist within the Corps' process to achieve the city's goals. And so we recommend proceeding incrementally, especially so through this EIS process beginning now. This is just laying out PED phase beginning 1 through 4, not all at once in sequence. They're funded in sequence. Construction's funded in sequence. That's where an opportunity is for the city to consider its financial cost share. Okay, number 2, this is the water plan recommendation. Integrate the water issues and opportunities with land use and development and all these ongoing efforts on the peninsula. It's got to be spatial and nature-based and design-driven. Charleston is a design city. It's not necessarily that Charleston needs another study or another plan. It's that these efforts need to be integrated in a way that anticipates the changes that are coming at the perimeter. I'm not going to go through all of these specific recommendations here, but the point is that use the momentum and the effort that's underway to begin to work towards that holistic approach. And finally, number 3 in my last slide, develop a clear stakeholder engagement and communication process for this project and for other flood work together on the peninsula. The city has a department leadership working group that has a weekly or bi-weekly call. We recommend considering that, continuing that, beginning further coordination with other agencies. Engage the public. The mayor has created this 3x3 advisory council, which is great. I applaud that, and encourage local and regional business community to be involved, and other parts of Charleston, other residents and citizens. Remove from consideration alignments and related options that are unacceptable to avoid wasting time talking about things that nobody wants. If there's an alignment that all stakeholders prefer, that is better in the city's interest, we recommend to stop talking about the others and move forward with the good idea. Devise an information strategy portal, someplace where all this information is accessible, readily accessible, and others can find what they need. I'll leave it there. This was a fire hose of information. I would encourage you to look at our discovery report soon to be released, and would welcome any questions. If Mark or David or the mayor or anyone has other final comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. David, would you like to add anything to those comments?
No questions. I mean, it raises questions and asks questions, and I'm sure the people in the room have more that they would like to ask. I don't know if there's time, but if there is, we're here.
Hey,
And
David, Mayor, can I just, I've been quiet and that's on purpose. I have wiser people around me and wiser people in Charleston, but let me just say this as a contextual process to move forward. We applaud what the Corps is doing. They are constricted or confined by regulation. That is no criticism of them, but they are restricted to surge. And that's okay, because surge is one of the water threats that Charleston must deal with. And we say must, because one ugly surge event, and you had 3 major storms nearby, 2015, 2016, 2017. If one of them would have hit Charleston, it would have been deadly and costly, and you'd still be recovering. So dealing with your surge risk is essential, but it is not your only risk. And let me put it this way. If you have a surge structure in place, the cost of constructing that and maintaining that will be far less, most likely, than the cost of repairing, restoring, and recovering from one storm. That's the evidence around the world. So just keep that in mind. So surge is essential, but it's not your only risk. And you have your stormwater risk, and you have your tidal risk, and you have your increasing tidal risk because of sea level rise, and what else, right? And you got this whole city peninsula you have to deal with. So the Corps effort on surge is an important, necessary start, but it is not everything you have to deal with. And what we've tried to show you here is within this context, within this 3x3 study, feasibility study, and within the future phases of PED and NED and PED and going forward, there are options and alternatives and ways to get this right? To improve upon or build upon what the Corps is doing for surge and not ignore those other problems. And we strongly believe, or I strongly believe, that, look, one surge event, as Mark showed at the beginning, could wipe out your economic viability. So that makes any internal recovery post-event without a surge risk reduction structure in place much more difficult. So keep all that in mind, that there are ways to improve this going forward. We think the Corps, if we were king, the Corps would be able to do more, but they can't by regulation. It's not a criticism. It is just a fact of life that we're trying to help you adapt to and see the other alternatives. Thank you.
Understood. Thank you for that. That's great. Ross, you had a question? Councilmember Appel.
maybe I'll save mine for the open discussion part, if that's still part of the program.
Yeah, time has kind of passed on. We handled questions kind of going along the way rather than saving them.
Okay.
So if you have a comment at this point, or as opposed to a question, I think that's okay, appropriate.
Sure. Thanks, Mayor. And Dale, I think you mentioned this, and this has been something that's been in my mind really since the beginning of my awareness of this effort is, we keep saying that the project focus is restricted to surge. And can we just, I just want to understand this. I mean, is this the product of like national politics that they couldn't say climate change and sea level rise, and so they had, I mean, is that what's going on here? I mean, I just want to be clear about that, and what's people's understanding of the origin of all this, because I mean, I'm just somebody who thinks, if this whole process is being governed and sort of hamstrung by that framing of this issue, I mean, that just raises a whole lot of questions. But I mean, is there clarity on that issue?
Yes. Well, I mean, here's how I would respond, Councilman. Pre-disaster planning that the Corps of Engineers does is fairly limited. Okay, they don't get into zoning, they don't get into land use. I mean, they're not allowed to. That is local, right? This is this issue of federalism. So what the Corps of Engineers does is when they look at risks that they can deal with, it's surge risk that has an impact to the national economy, and then they have lower levels of regional economic impacts, right? So the Corps of Engineers looks at that, and it's primarily surge that they're able to say, we can do something about this. So that's why their focus is in pre-disaster planning is on dealing with or mitigating the surge risk to national economic interest, right? Okay, so that's this NED milestone that has to be met. That is existing policy. It's been long-standing policy. There are a few places in the U.S. as an exception where the Corps of Engineers has done other things, including in New Orleans and in St. Louis and a few other places, but mostly it's surge. Post-disaster, money is just thrown at a city or a place that's dealing with impacts from a storm, and then it's the Corps of Engineers, and then it's FEMA, and it's HUD, and it's DOT, and it's the whole panoply of federal agencies that are trying to respond. So the pre-disaster, this feasibility study is really limited by law to surge risk reduction, simply because all those other things regarding land use and transportation and all that stuff, and stormwater management and groundwater management, the Corps just doesn't do that because that's local responsibility. Sometimes state, but mostly local. And we know how locals feel about federal intrusion, and the Corps of Engineers has respected that. So that's the genesis of the policy.
Could I add to that discussion that the Corps did increase their estimate of sea level rise for this feasibility study? Wes mentioned that to 1.43 feet. Now, you could argue, well, our estimate is a little bit higher, but council member, they're not like denying climate change and the fact that sea level rise is occurring. They work that into the model. You could say, well, gee, it might be more conservative to say it's 2.5 feet versus 1.4 feet, but they do have that baked into the model.
Right. And let me add, one of the things that the Corps of Engineers does, and we work with the Corps, I worked with the Corps when I was with the Dutch, because they have this interaction with how do you deal with surge risk and other risks. The Corps of Engineers is not afraid of sea level rise, or they're not afraid to mention that internally or externally. They just have certain criteria that they have to follow by regulation. And so that's what they do. I mean, they're very good engineers, but they follow that engineering approach. Not a criticism, it's just the fact. We know that. The most difficult thing for the Corps of Engineers in the past, but there is really a very positive development in the last 2 or 3 years, is the Corps of Engineers is trying to understand not how to mitigate surge solely with concrete and steel or hard structures. They're trying to figure out how to quantify benefits from natural, nature-based and softer features so that they can plug that into their BCA process, so their BCRs can their BCR can have an output that incorporates that. They're not there yet. They're not there yet, but they're moving in that direction, and it is very exciting for a lot of folks. So again, the focus on this wall or the structure, you can see what was shown is simply because that's what the core does. And it has externalities, as we say in economics. There are serious externalities with a concrete structure, but that's what they do. And a concrete structure does mitigate surge risk very effectively. We'll talk to the Dutch about it. They have a lot of it, right? So.
But again, it's an integrated approach.
Yeah.
And our country's state of the art is not high in that respect. And that is, again, no offense to the Corps. It is the set of rules with which we operate. They're not effective. Charleston, South Carolina could be a model for a way to think about an effective set of rules. But that would require some external research money. But you're a perfect case for further study of
Right.
what it should be, not what it is. The regulations the Corps operates under do not maximize in our terms. You know, everybody has different understandings of words. You know, optimize. What does that mean? Well, that's the discussion that if you're going to be a polar model, a polar city, a political place that understands water and self-interest and its investment profile and self-determining and the King City and God City and all that, you know, you're going to have to take on yourselves, because right now Dale did a brilliant job of explaining how we got here. Question is, where are we going to go? And you're the front line.
And we want to have the best plan going forward, and this is part of that process.
Nancy and West both said they want to make this feasibility study and this NED plan and this PED phase, a mark for the rest of the nation, a mark for other places. We've tried to show you ways to work with the Corps of Engineers to get there. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be perfect, but we can improve this process if we do this right. We meaning the collective we.
Councilmember Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to everybody who's continuing our education in real time. I just can't tell you how much we respect and appreciate y'all for all those reasons. I just wanted to follow on to what David was saying about Charleston has the chance to be, sort of like the poster child of something new and integrated. And so I just wanted to clarify, I'm assuming that the answer is we don't have to stop one to pick up another, right? We can do the more holistic water management thinking and the integrative work that you're talking about while we're pursuing the process with the Corps. Am I right about that?
That might be to me, Carol. I'm not the one to answer that. That's up to you. Yes, you can. You could. It's the question of capability of the city financially and others, and the ability to get somebody in Washington to say, that'd be a good place to spend a couple $1 million, right? That'd be a place to figure out what really, because you're a perfect scale and your beautiful model, beautiful, but that's idealism, architects practice in that.
Councilmember Seekings.
Well, David, I just wanted to sort of touch on that and Councilmember Jackson's question. I mean, it seems to me that in listening to your presentation today and the many, many presentations you've given about Charleston and other places, not just in the country, but around the world, an integrated and integrative approach has always been sort of one of the core major premise principles. And Councilmember Jackson's question about separating out the Army Corps from everything else we need to do, to me, while it's possible, would not be optimal. It seems to me that the 2 or the 3 or the 10 or the 20, there's many, really need to be integrated so that we have a long-term water management plan that takes into account short-term goals, middle-term goals, and then long-term goals. Because one of the things that was not really focused on tonight, but if we go through all 4 phases of the Army Corps of Engineers project, we're looking at 30 to 40 years down the road. And, many of the assumptions that will have been built into the Army Corps project and other projects, including the sea level rise projections, are going to adjust upwards, right? So it just seems to me, I'm hoping that we will, with yours and others' guidance, figure out a way to integrate the perimeter system with other needs that we've got, not just on, but off the peninsula.
Right, and that's recommendation number 2.
Right.
And that's where I believe we've been heading for the last few years, frankly, with our strategies and all the things that we're working on. But yeah, continuing to integrate all those things together is a challenge before us. Anybody else have any other questions or comments?
I do, Mr. Mayor.
Yes, sir. Councilmember Waring.
I mean, all of this is, frankly, some of this information is awestruck. I mean, it's great information. I mean, core and obviously the information that recently provided. I actually think that portion is a little bit more organized than our funding portion. This community has funded billion-dollar opportunities in the past, but it takes a momentum to do it. And if you say, what are you talking about? I'm sure you remember this too. I remember when John Graham Altman, for new folks, he used to be a very vibrant chairman of the school board, and he referred to 75 Calhoun Street, if you all are familiar with that building, as the Taj Mahal. He thought it was, had golden doorknobs. But, it's a good government building, but it is not the Taj Mahal. But that message went out to the community as a no new tax piece. And our Charleston County had 77 schools in it, and a lot of those schools were functionally obsolete from a buildings perspective. Long story short, there were a series of half-cent sales tax bond referendums to improve our physical plant. When we would try to recruit industry to the area, we didn't have a good high school to carry them to. We would carry our recruiters up at the Regional Development Alliance, would carry them to Stratford, would carry them to Somerville High, because Mount Pleasant Wando had, I think, 71 trailers or something like that out there. You can't recruit industry in if you have to pay people to put their kids in private school. That said, it was a momentum. Consultants were hired to help pass half-cent sales tax referendum, which fast forward 15 years, school district has spent over $1.4 billion building new schools in the Charleston. You'd be hard pressed to find a school today in Charleston County that's dilapidated. Might have some trouble with curriculum, but the physical plant looks great. Highways, Ravenel Bridge. The option was we needed $600 million to build it. We needed a half-cent sales tax to do some other roads. It was $1.2 or $3 billion. It took momentum and a campaign to get that, half-cent sales tax passed. And now, we got the Ravenel Bridge, and we don't know anything else. I think it's going to take a momentum like that to raise the city's match for the Corps of Engineers. If the number is 660,000, we all know we got this thing called a change order. And before this thing is built, the city's match is going to be more than 600 million. But if we don't put together we can't tax our people to that level. There has to be a concerted effort from a campaign standpoint. And I don't know if we can do a half-cent sales tax for a city, but something different in the funding mechanism on the local level has to be engaged for us to be able to generate. I think we can do it now, don't get me wrong, to get the collective monies to be able to get the comprehensive fix. Now, if that's going to be a city half-cent sales tax or whatever, but I know one thing, it's not going to be able to be done through property taxes. It's not going to be able to be done through stormwater fees alone. So, Mr. Mayor, I'm asking from the standpoint of when are we going to start putting together a strategy? And when I say we, I'm talking all 13 of us and more on how we can have a broad approach to make for our citizens to say, it makes sense. yeah, I'll pay that fee if we get these fixes in place and, you know, my driveway quits flooding in my backyard. I don't have to worry about it coming up to my steps and threatening my home. And I guess in part, that's one reason in a small way, I say we need to put these signs out there every time we clean a ditch or every time we put in new pipes or whatever it is, new culverts, to build that momentum out in the community that, you know, these people are out here working, fixing things out here. And we are. We just need to tell our story better, because when people see that we've got work going on from one end of the city to the other, which we are, in a campaign type way, when we do come for a comprehensive fix, people all across this city will say, yeah, they've been in my community right down my street. They fixed this problem. It's been there for 20 years and we don't have that problem anymore. And we got stories like that that we can tell that we've been beginning to do all over this city. Yes, that's why last meeting I was a little bit intimidated by this 3x3 committee, because I am intimidated by creating parochialism when it comes to draining stormwater dollars. This community has been there before. You've taken us away from there, and I don't want to go back to that. Okay? So, but a broad campaign, eventually we're going to have to go to our citizens and ask for money in a broad way to find the dollars to do the match on this. And not asking for an answer today, but I do believe we need to have some sort of brainstorming session on how to, you know, the reason I brought up half cents, that's probably some of the most cost-effective dollars that we spend in this community. You know, nobody talked about the Ravenel Bridge being over cost. You know why? Because it came in under the budget. All these schools we've built, nobody has said, boy, one of them has been a boondoggle. Not even one out of 1.4 billion. If we take that same approach and we learn from that, we can build a momentum to get money in a broad way. So, you know, half-cent sales tax on a local level, I don't know if the state allows us to do that, if we need to get the law changed. It probably doesn't, but I can remember when we didn't have local option sales taxes too. That's something that had to be approached from the state level. Everything came through Columbia, and then the politicians said, you know what, Mikey, if you want to raise taxes down in your locale, you can do it. And you know what, we've done wonders with it. People up around Rock Hill and outside of Charlotte has done wonderful with it, with their roadways and things up there. So I say all that to say, when it comes to the strategy that we're going to employ to garner the dollars to match, you know, between $600 and probably $800 million, you know, we have to think collectively on that, Mr. Mayor. And I'm eager to get to that part, because we can't get to the point of having communities compete against one another for limited dollars that we have now.
Amen. I concur, and it will take that kind of big marketing effort. And it's not just the construction, as Dale and Andy and David have pointed out, it's the maintenance and operation of the system over time as well. It has to be sustainable. It has to be an income source that's going to continue over time, that allows us to operate this system, and not just the perimeter wall system, but the integrated water plan system. It's got to be the whole package. And,
I agree.
And yeah, a lot of thought has gone into it, not enough yet. That is one of the directives for our advisory committee that we're forming, that they explore the financing options that other cities and jurisdictions have done with similar projects around the country, and make recommendations back to us, and that will happen this year. I know Amy and Mark have been to conferences, and a lot of thought has been put into it already, but we got a ways to go. The state legislature is considering this year allowing additional infrastructure sales tax for local jurisdictions. I don't think it'll pass this year, but this would be an incredible case in point to make in Columbia that there's a need for us to have that authority. So anyway, you're right on point. Absolutely, Councilman. Thank you. All right. Anybody else? Any questions, thoughts, comments?
Mayor, this is Doug Gregory again. The only thing I would add, when you say full package, and I agree with you, when we talk about this, we're focusing on the peninsula. But if we were to do a 1/2-cent sales tax, I think the question is going to be what's in it for me when we start looking west of the Ashley and other parts. So if we do something like that, you know, in addition to maintenance, construction, with regard to the seawall, I think somehow we're going to have a piece of that in there for every single part of the city of Charleston in order for it to pass.
Absolutely. It has to be integrated, not just
Yes.
surge protection on the peninsula.
Yeah.
I mean, it's clear that the Corps, you know, scoped this analysis, this whole project, based on where they thought the best cost benefit would occur. I mean, we have a lot of, and many of them are structural building employment assets that happen to be on the peninsula. And, you know, that's what drove the focus area for the study. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, they're as valuable as all of our homes are, they don't they don't touch the value of a big corporation or of a big port structure or of historical facilities, right? So the Corps of Engineers isn't involved in protecting whatever neighborhoods. Wagner Terrace might be an exception, right? Because of its integration with the rest of the peninsula. The Corps of Engineers is really protecting national economic assets. So
hospitals, you know, colleges, universities.
Right.
So that's how we got here. And I mean, I get it. That makes a lot of sense from the parameters they're working under, but we have to have an integrated plan for the whole city of Charleston, for all our citizens. And I think that's what we're going to do. So Andy and Dale, David, thank y'all for being our partners and helping us walk through this as well. Y'all are amazing, and we look forward to continuing our partnership. Mark, you want to come back with any closing comments? Or
I'm going to make these real short, Mayor, just because of time. I want to be respectful. I'll just tell council that, you know, we've got great partners with the Corps. We get great advice and partnership with Wagner and Ball. And our intent is to keep working through till we get to August, September timeframe. We'll come back to you with more decisions at that time. And other than that, I just want to thank everybody for the great questions and the interaction. This has been really helpful. And we will come back and answer questions and have discussions as frequently as you would like, and maybe make it a regular update that we do on occasions. We have a lot of work to do. There's a lot more to do. We're not anywhere close to done. There's a lot of work to do, particularly with this EIS. It's going to require a lot of work to push through the EIS over the next 4 to 5 months. So thank you all very much. And it's getting late.
Right. Wes and Nancy, thank y'all again too. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Work.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
All right.
everybody.
Talk to y'all soon.